welcome everyone. This is Jan Rosenkranz, with in mineral processing at Luleå University of Technology in northern Sweden. And it's a pleasure to share this session together with my colleague.
Yes. Good morning. I'm Johanna Linus. I'm a senior geoscientist from the Ministry of Mines and Energy in Namibia.
So we will have, under the heading of social relevant 2 slots with in total 6 presentations, and we will split it, and starting with a block of 3. We experienced it yesterday already. Each presentation will be then 8 minutes plus 2 minutes urging questions, and then after the slot, we take the discussion then with all 3 presentations. So the topic areas are quite broad. So the question of efficiency and sufficiency is in a way then also touching the society. So we will talk about minerals for society, mobility, conservation, and also then questions of water use and water distribution, waste management, particularly when it comes to composting, and digitalization. So it's what, as we say in Sweden, is a smörgåsbord, so quite a lot of different topics on one table. Good. The first speaker I want to introduce is then a colleague from Norway, so Harald Sverdrup from the Inland Norway University, and he's professor in system dynamics, and will talk about modeling and simulation approaches. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So, I'm going to talk about the final countdown. We're talking about resources here today, and a key question here is, how much is there? What are we talking about? So what are we discussing in quantitative terms? And for doing this, you need to do several things. One is modeling to stretch it over time. We're working with the concept of sustainability. I am in favor of defining sustainability in quantitative terms. We absolutely need to do that. So we can set a goal and put a number on it, and we can count up where we are today and put a number on it, and we can see what is the gap. How far are we from the goal? We're going to count up a lot of things. So this has taken time. I started working on this 2011, worked every year on it, and it's been grinding on. It's a lot of metals, fuels, synthetic materials, energy kinds, everything we fish out of nature in one way or another. Also including ecosystems and social and human resources. So a long way we've done. We've been a team putting together a model called World 7, based ultimately on the World 3 model that came in 1972. At that time, so here you can see all the different modules. Every box has a model inside it. Every red line is one or more causal links. I went to all these conferences and all that. Everybody talked about how everything is linked, and nobody linked it. And next year, same story. And it's gone on like that for 30 years. So in the end, I said, okay, same story as always. I have to link it myself. And here we're going to look at this, where we look at all the different metals and minerals. And we're going to look at different aspects of this thing and count it all up. And so we look at extraction rates, we need natural resources prices, we need to distinguish between what's geologically present and what you can actually dig up. Actually, what you can dig up. So geologists will say there's a lot around there. Sure, they're right, but you can't dig it up. So, much of it's too deep, lies in the wrong place. You don't have access, or your yields aren't good enough, so you don't get it all out. all of this boils down to everything not being available, as you see on the geography map. This is a flow chart for monetary value behind this model. It was done before the model was made to map out where does wealth come from. It looks a little bit different than what you find in economic textbooks, because I want to go to the root of where the wealth comes from. And so the boxes on top there, the gray and the green, are the resources. Here is the capitals, the different capital boxes in terms of money, but it actually starts as physical resources. We do it like this, you get a model that's mass and energy balance consistent economic model. You really need to do that when we talk about regions. You can't do the usual cheats which you do in statistical models, for the simple reason that when it comes to physical resources, you can't use them. You can't use negative apples or non-existing iron. It just doesn't work. This is at the basis of what we're going to do. And then we counted it up, all of it, through all of this. I'm not going to go through the table, but it means finding out how much is there, how much is available, how much is known, and how much can we know that is there, but we haven't found it yet. And this occurs over time. It's not present here. But if then remind you about the definition of sustainability, that is to be sufficient for us here present now, but also for future generations. That's very many more than us, which means these resources are not only for us, it's for future generations for quite a while. We do go through this. One of the things we see is that as we go through the grades, all the qualities of the resources are declining. This is a documentable fact. What happens when it goes through, here I listed some of them, is that you can get it out of the ground, but it costs you more and more energy. And the energy expenditure rises exponentially as the grade goes down linear. This is pretty disastrous for a lot of the resources. Copper used to be 30% in the ore. Some years ago, it went down to 10. Now it's below 3, on the way to 0.5%. And energy cost has gone up proportionally much more. Prices go up. It's very expensive to get out. What we can see here is actually has happened before. Just as a side note, we took the model and ran it on the Roman Empire. What they did also is they expanded their resource catch at that time in terms of humans, wood, silver, metals, expanded to the Atlantic Ocean, to the north, to the cold barrier, into the south, into the Sand Ocean, and they met up with the Persians in the east, and they couldn't expand anymore. That's when it flattened out. They continued to consume and spend. They overspent, and the empire ended. Very many empires did this. If we look at it, we run business as usual on the globe, on the global industrial empire, which doesn't have one government, but many, where we use the same pool of resources. We see that we can expand for a while, and we do run out. That is, we don't really run out of resources, but we run out of money and ability to get it. It gets too expensive. This is my next final slide. So the conclusion is, there are going to be big changes. You saw that blob, it stops in 2350 if we continue as now. That means all generations after will have very little resources. We pull the curtain on that. So we have a challenge here to distribute that large blob over time. We're running out of cheap everything. I think the fact of the matter is, limits are coming. We had limits in the past. Now we live in a time where we took away limits for a short while. They're coming back. Get used to everything costing double and having half the pay. It's coming. Not very fast, but it's coming. And business as usual, there's no avoidance of. We will also challenge our democracy. We need to be quite aware of that. We need to stand up for it. I think it's quite important to initiate change now. We will still have capital and resources available to do the change. The change that needs to be done needs also a lot of materials. We need to do it while we still have them. At present, we use them linearly, means we waste them all. Recycling rates, it's not what we talk about. They're deplorably poor and continue to be so. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, any other questions?
I have one. Thank you, Professor. I know the recycling world is not the solution, but in this moment, I would like to ask you if you have you considered consider the urban mining solution?
Yes, it is. So what we do is we make, so recycling is dependent on two factors. One is the commercial push. Gets more valuable, you go and get it just for as a commercial thing. And then there's another push, which are existing on some other metals, which is cultural. We have a learned behavior not to throw them away. We trained it in on aluminium. It's since history for silver and gold. Nobody throws it away. So that recycles very well. All this training we need to do. And to solve this is going to be a grand puzzle of all kinds of different solutions. Recycling is one of them. Try to get circularity is another part of the puzzle. None of these will solve it alone. But we need to do put all the keys we have in play.
Still need to consider that technical limitations in the recycling.
Yes, and so I've looked through the yields for all these resources. I think we covered something like 69 different resources. And you get a little bit sad when you see the yields in recovery, but also in primary extraction. Some of them, the metals with the exotic names, gallium, germanium, indium, they have extraction yields of 16%, 25%, or 32%. So we lose a lot.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. Thanks a lot for your presentation. Did you do the math behind the consumption, raw material consumption of ancient Rome? And where do the data come? Where does the data come from?
So I have 8 minutes.
Yeah, I know, but
Well, over here, so works.
Maybe
I'll explain to you afterwards.
Meeting.
But we do, it's a large system model. So activities generate demands, which puts askance into markets. We model markets. So commodity markets, we model prices, there's feedback in it.
Sure. But maybe we can
We take it out.
So, thank you again.
Thank you.
All right. The next speaker comes on, Christoph Gonzi, he's associate professor in environmental humanities.
Yes.
So he will talk about transition ability.
That's right. Thanks a lot for your introduction and for the invitation. I'm French. Based in Grenoble, I run a master's program called Resources, Environment and Societies in Transition. And I have focused recently on transportation issues in California. So I'll be speaking about California and its dynamics in terms of transition. I have a specific interest in the management of natural resources, and so why I'm here, and in sufficiency measures and practices. So I'd like to introduce you to a project called Mobility in Transition. It's not a mature project. I've been working on it for a year and a half. I partnered with colleagues from the geology department in Grenoble, trying to connect societal dynamics to the underground. I've also worked with a colleague from UCLA and carried out a number of online interviews with people from academia and from the activist world in Southern California. I used, in terms of methodology, I tried to connect quantitative and qualitative data to mix number with narratives, as I like to put it. I'll start with 4 keywords to introduce the project. Transportation, you all know it's a key sector of the transition. I'm sure you have figures in mind. It's responsible for 24% of greenhouse gas emissions globally, up to 50% in California, 25% of the global energy consumption, global energy consumption, and the sector relies on fossil fuels for 95% of its energy. So, of course, transportation is a resource-intensive sector that has been identified by various communities, scholars, activists, countries, and states as one of the key sectors of the transition. California is both an emblem of the Anthropocene and of its excesses, and an icon of the fight against climate change. And we can come back to this, of course. The history behind it is interesting. Environmental history is what I'm doing. It helps to look at long-term dynamics. In this case, the evolution of mobility, of the weight of cars, of infrastructures, and the policies that have shaped how we, and in this case, Californians, move around. Industrial ecology, that's my colleagues from Grenoble, helps to measure and track material flows, and had some hint of that before. So the question can be formulated in simple terms. How do we go from this to that? How do we go from a car-centric culture to streets for all? How do we shrink the socio-ecological footprint of the sector? And what are countries, states doing to reduce the impact of the sector? And so that leads me to the third slide and to one option we put on the project. We started by looking in detail at the transition scenario of California. Why transition scenarios? Because, as you know, they are key or supposedly key instruments to organize sectoral transitions, and it seemed relevant to start the discussion from this point. These scenarios are developed by leading institutions. In this case, it's of course the state of California, and they are meant to explore the different possible low carbon transitions and to plan and give the impetus to the transition. So when you look at the scoping plan, which is the name of the scenario developed by California, you have pretty much the same idea, which is to lay out a path to achieve targets for carbon neutrality, you know about the story, and reduce anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions by 85% below 1990 levels, no later than 2045, which is similar to what we have in Europe. So the scoping plan relies on 4 assumptions. First, decoupling. Yes, you can grow your economy and yet reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. Second, greenhouse gas emission accountability should only include scope 1 and 2 and exclude scope 3 emissions. Third, greenhouse gas emissions constitute the only socio-ecological indicator used to build a plan. I'll come back to that. And last, the transition within the transportation sector that we're studying should focus on new technology, mostly electric vehicles, on biofuels, and on the reduction of VMTs for vehicle miles traveled. So needless to say, that the scoping plan is the product of highly competent people. I'm going to be critical, but of course, I'm aware that these people are they're competent. Yet a close reading of the plan and its annexes that come along opens up room for discussion. All the assumptions which supports the plan absolutely need to be questioned and debated. I do not have time here to get into detail, of course, but I'd like to highlight the key element of the project. The section devoted to transportation leaves aside the question of natural resources. Natural resources behind electric vehicles, behind biofuels, the connection between VMTs and natural resources do not give rise to a clear quantification. The plan provides no information on the quantity of raw materials needed to support the transition at the level of the territory. Annex B does mention raw materials, but only insofar as mapping out the global resources, not by quantifying the needs for the state of California. In other words, the scoping plan identifies where the key raw materials are located and in which known quantity, but it does not quantify how much California will grab from the international market. This ignores the global competition inherent to raw material markets, the potential depletion, as we've just heard, of raw materials, the externalities embedded in the plan. All told, the material footprint is not taken into account, the necessary decrease in raw material consumption not considered and planned. It's the big absentee of the plan. So the next stage of the project has been to confront the scoping plan to the literature on the sustainable management of natural resources. In an attempt to define what a sustainable global economy could look like from the angle of resource consumption, Stephen Bringuezou from the RRT, sorry, I'm going to I forget about it, I'll come back to it. Stephen Bringuezou proposed to reduce by a factor of 2 the annual global consumption, the annual global footprint from 100 billion tons per year to 50 billion tons per year. For the transportation sector, these studies have shown that a sustainable transportation sector should limit annual per capita consumption at 2 tons of materials. So the material footprint should follow a steep decline, okay? And in the best of all possible worlds, transition scenarios should plan for it, which is not the case for the scoping plan. So from a resource-oriented perspective, and if California were to meet its social and environmental goals, it should integrate the material footprint indicator in the plan. Of course, downsize its means of transport. Cars have gotten bigger and bigger, as you know. Third, it should also reform its institutions. We could come back to this if you like. And last, it should take into account long-term dynamics. They are absent in the plan. History shows that, for example, bigger roads lead to more people driving, but also that more bike paths, for example, lead to more people riding their bikes. And so by way of conclusion, 4 bullet points. The scoping plan is no exception. Other transition scenarios have the same objectives and rely on the same assumptions. The scoping plan is too optimistic, and it's within its potential to meet the social and environmental targets. Sufficiency should play a central role in the scenario. Research at the crossroads of quantitative and qualitative methods can help reshape scenarios. And last, alternative resource-oriented scenarios are needed. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah. Any direct questions? Yep, please.
Thank you for the presentation. I would like to ask about the qualitative data you mentioned. Who did you talk to?
Yeah, I talked to, as I said, it's an ongoing project. I talked to two people from UCLA, one who's a scholar, one who's close to institutions, the state notably, and I talked to activists, on-the-ground activists. We saw the logo Streets for All. I had a 30-minute interview with one of the actors of the group. I've also talked to a couple of people from Streets for All, Streets blog. It's a very fine online media that covers transportation issues across the US, and they have a segment related to Southern California.
Question?
So in the scoping report, I know that you said that they offer some alternatives. Is public transport an alternative that they look at seriously? I'm not familiar with California and their public transport.
Yeah, it's part of the, so they have three, there are three ways of looking at the reduction of VMTs, vehicle mass travels, and one is public transportation. So it's a target, but it's also a huge problem. Less and less people actually take public transit
Yeah.
transport in
That's why,
California.
we see it all over that as soon as
Yes.
they are on, the public services start to
Yeah.
diminish. And I was just wondering how, in the scoping, if that was an option that they are viably looking at.
See, this is a very interesting question because it is an option, and the plan's target is actually based on more people using public transport. But if you look at the actual dynamics, people are using less and less public transport. So,
And for US, it's probably also the question of what's the technology that you use for that? I mean, if it's all fossil fueled system, maybe we'll do only small steps. Okay, but I think this was also one question I had with the alternatives that we may discuss while we're turning down.
thank you.
Good. So, thank you. Then third speaker in this first slot to come in front. So Dr. Innocent Sintumul. He has a background in the environmental studies and is senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow. We'll talk about indigenous knowledge, forest conservation.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Innocent Sentinel. I'm from University of Johannesburg in the Department of Geography, Environmental Management, and Energy Studies. I prepared this presentation for 15 minutes, but it's like I'm only supposed to spend only 8 minutes. So I'll try and be as quick as possible. This is where I come from. This is the university that I'm attached to. The concept of indigenous knowledge system, I mean, has been there for ages, but over the past 4 decades, I mean, scholars have obviously developed, I mean, a lot of interest in indigenous knowledge system, I mean, for various reasons, and one of them is the fact that it contributes a lot in terms of biodiversity conservation. Although there is no universally accepted definition, I preferred Becker's definition of indigenous knowledge system as a cumulative body of knowledge and belief handed down through generation by cultural transmission about relationship of living being with one another and with their environment. And there are quite a number of other terms that are also used to define indigenous knowledge system. Obviously, the concept of political knowledge, traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, etc., etc. Even though there's no acceptable definition, most of the scholars agree that this knowledge is dynamic, it is evolving, it's culturally embedded, and contextually specific. And they also agree that it is rooted in cultural and artistic practices like cosmological beliefs, short terms, proverbs, taboo, and myth. And so these are the most important things that contribute a lot towards biodiversity conservation. Obviously, you don't need rangers here, you don't need police, you don't need soldiers to be guarding resources in a particular area, but the cosmological beliefs, the issue of proverbs, the issue of taboos, plays a critical role in biodiversity conservation. Why indigenous knowledge system? There are quite a number of reasons that are given in the literature. I've given quite a number, but I will obviously dwell a few because of time. It's simple and practical. Obviously, it limits resource extraction. So you only extract enough, to make a living. It's not for commercial purposes. And obviously, it also encourages sustainable utilization of resources. That is key. It provides also practical solution to environmental problems. It links the survival of every human being, the wholeness of nature. And obviously, this knowledge is basic, but also provide rich ground for development of modern society. And importantly, it is also flexible. And another important aspect of indigenous knowledge system is the fact that it is now internationally recognized. I mean, there are quite a number of organizations that acknowledges the importance of the indigenous knowledge system. Look at Article 8J of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, the World Bank Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report, target number 18, Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. All these organizations recognizes the importance of indigenous knowledge system, particularly in biodiversity conservation, which is the literature informing the study, and quite a number of studies has been conducted on indigenous knowledge system, specifically focusing on forest and conservation of forest and wildlife, like a study that was done in Zimbabwe, a study that was done in Ghana, which also looked at the significance of indigenous knowledge system in ecosystem services and management. A study conducted in India, Iran, and Philippines that has also looked at the role of indigenous knowledge system in natural resource management. But in the context of South Africa, I mean, very little has been done, and obviously I want to try and fill the existing gaps in terms of knowledge. In terms of where the study is conducted, it is conducted in South Africa. And the aim of this particular study, obviously, is to identify and describe the key indigenous practices used to conserve the forest and to examine the attitudes held by local communities. And I argue that despite that indigenous knowledge system is marginalized in the democratic South Africa, it plays a key role in natural resource management for forest and conservation in the 21st century. And to advance this particular argument, obviously, I'm using Tatewoli Forest as my study area, which is situated in Wembley region in Limpopo, and as you can see on this map, Limpopo, the province and borders Zimbabwe on the northern side. It also borders Kruger National Park on the eastern side. And this is where the holy forest is actually located. So obviously, I have collected the data using qualitative and quantitative approach. Obviously, the results were analyzed qualitatively and quantitatively. And the next slide will obviously present the results of this particular study. And I've used a knowledge practice belief framework, which was developed by Beckers in 1999 to analyze my data. Obviously, I looked at the knowledge of plants and animal species that local people have. And they also have, because they've been staying in the area for so many years, they also have knowledge on how they're managing resources. The issue of social institution is also key when you're dealing with indigenous system and worldview, the belief, system that people have and how they contribute towards national resource management. So this is what you see as you enter the forest. This sign has been placed by the Department of Environmental Affairs. The area is not managed by Environmental Affairs, but because of the value of the area, they've seen the value of this particular forest. We decided to put this particular sign at the entrance, and you can see when you're inside, there's a road that passes through the forest. Obviously, you cannot drive off road. You can only remain in that particular road. That is when you are inside. This is when you enter. And you can see how thick is the forest. Obviously, as I said, it is not managed by government. This is managed by indigenous people. And this is inside the forest, and it is obviously managed by the Sidziwe clan. And one of the management strategies is the issue of customs and ritual. They do their ritual, they do their burial in the area, and no human activities is allowed inside the forest. There's also myth and taboo that there is a spirit of Chief Netate who appears in the shape and the form of a white lion, and obviously no person is expected to enter that particular forest except the clan members who only enters the area, to perform cultural, practices. And as a result of that, that is obviously played an important role. And there are also some taboos, as you can see there. You cannot do, hunting, you cannot cut plant species in the area, nor of driving. You cannot do any activity in the area, and there are quite a number of retribution. If ever you do anything, it is believed that you can be blind, you can be dead, you can be mad, or you can disappear to the forest. And there are also rules and regulations that also support the issue of taboo that I talked about. And if you look at the list of activities, I've moved into the forest to try and see if there were evidence of deforestation, if there were evidence of guards who are protecting the area. And you can see, there are no rangers. There's no human activities. There's no deforestation, as you can see on the right-hand side. And in terms of attitude, obviously, people have got positive attitude with regard to the forest, and we don't do anything in that particular forest. And that has obviously played a critical role in conserving the area. In terms of conclusion, obviously, I've identified the issue of myth and rituals, taboo and myth, rules and regulation as the main important factors that contribute a lot towards biodiversity conservation. And obviously, local communities also have positive attitudes towards the area, but that positive attitude are obviously linked to obedience, which has obviously played a critical role in conserving the forest. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now maybe then start the discussion, and I also ask Christoph and Harald come in front, maybe. Okay. Related to this talk. Yes, please.
Yes, Dias Kuman, also from South Africa. Innocent, do you think our government will give voice to this indigenous knowledge in policies? Are there any movement? This is not my area of speciality at all. Is there any movement at all to?
At the moment, there is a policy on indigenous knowledge system in South Africa. But obviously, it's just a policy. But obviously, if you look at what is happening on the ground, these people are not really recognized. Their indigenous knowledge system, they are not really recognized. I think there's a lot, that is actually taking place. If you think about the sun, they've been fighting for ages. Sitting near the parliament for ages, but nothing much is happening. It's just a piece of paper that has been written, but in terms of implementation, there is very little that is actually.
I am Ruth Pamantigan Bermuda, I'm a local community representative. So ILK is basically the contributions that we bring to the international conventions. And just coming out of the IPBES meeting, our contributions have been recognized. And I'm sure you know that in most of the lands that were surveyed globally, those in ILK territories are best conserved. The Jeff Assembly, just taking place also, has a fund set up from the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and now 20% of the funding has to come down to reach IPLCs. So at the international level, it's recognized, but locally, it's the local people who know the resources, the uses of them. And that's why we put our lives on the fence to defend you know, the destruction of these resources. I'm from Antigua, it's a tourism place. And they like the lands at the coastline for the hotels, and so it's gonna destroy our mangroves, which is our first line of defense. So we have to advocate, we have to build alliances to ensure that our knowledge of our resources are maintained. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. So, other questions, comments on the three contributions?
Okay, no, no, go ahead. So have you thought about the digital technologies or digital transformation factors into your model? Have you factored digital transformation into your model? Innovation and technology to your models, how that impacts or not?
Yes, that is factored in with, you know, with drivers from education, resources allocated to research such things. So what becomes very evident when you make a model like this is that society has a fantastic similarity to ecology in terms of, you know, like an ecological pyramid. Somebody said that, well, you're a professor, you only need a pencil. Oh, no, I'm the most expensive because we are at the top of the pyramid and there's a lot of primary production with first line resources and then manufacture upon that. It grows up. This is included in it.
Is it included as factors, or can you also, when you talk about dynamic simulation, also phase in some events that there's a abrupt technology change, or there's some other event like we have nowadays with wars starting and pandemics coming in the picture?
You can phase in some of that. So behind the model, so the model is not run on calibration to time series. It's causal links inside the model. So in order to have technical advance, you need to educate people, you need to do research, fund it, and that together, you know, plays up the ground for doing inventions, and then inventions happen. It also has this kind of, if you pull down the funding for research, you get less inventions, and things start to react in there. Now, of course, to put it, some of the things that humans do are not really rational, and thereby also very hard to predict. Random actions. Individuals doing irrational things can sometimes put hiccups into the system. What I do see when we do such a model and when we go to conferences like this, I realize that there are three arenas we need to win. The technical arena where I belong, and that's actually appears to be difficult, but it isn't. That's actually what we're best at. Then it's the social and communication arena. And that's very hard, and it's become even harder. We used to call it communication arena, but now it's communication, media, social media, attention arena. It's become quite complicated. I'm not sure I really understand how it all works. We need to win that too. And we have the political arena. As policymaker once told me, he told me about this. He said, if you win two of them, the third will come along. I think this is some of the challenges we're up against. We should take care to win these two arenas that to me are not my home arena, the technical one or the scientific one. Communication arena and the political arena is maybe more difficult.
I have two questions, one for you and one for you. I'm just wondering, and I don't know if it's included in your model or you investigated, but is the whole digitalization, is this leading to less resource use or resource use?
Well, it's a behavioral question you're actually asking.
Mhm.
And so what do we do in our communication arena or communication and media arena? Well, we urge for more and more consumption all the time. So we're pushing the world in the wrong direction. Yep. So very few aspects of the communication arena is included in the model in terms of causalities, for the simple reason that it's nastily difficult to do. And the political arena, I try to include parts of that can be described. When you build a model like this, it's it's an evolving system. Many people work on it. It changes often. As we use it, we learn more. As more colleagues are involved in it, we learn more. It's never ready. By the way, it's made for tax money, so anybody that wants it and pays tax can have it. You have to pay
Yeah,
taxes though.
I have also a question for Innocent. I'm really interested in these indigenous practices, but as a Western person, I'm also afraid of cultural appropriation. And so I'm wondering, what is, in your view, could be value for like Europe or even my country, Belgium?
I don't know. I mean, I think the issue of indigenous knowledge system, I mean, it should be everywhere. You should have your own indigenous knowledge system. Possibly. Because it's not only, I mean, it doesn't only occur in Africa and Asia. I mean, there's a lot of literature on indigenous knowledge system in Asia and Africa. But I believe that each and every, because this is culturally embedded, so obviously each and every country should have its own each and every country you should have your own indigenous knowledge system. It may be different from this because this is more related to forest conservation. In some cases, you may find that it is a pool that is protected because it is believed that you cannot do anything on that particular pool. I mean, some people may even be used, I mean, by getting into that pool. There's that belief that people have, and as a result of that, you end up protecting that particular area. So in the same manner, I mean, in this case, it's a burial ground for a certain clan, but you cannot do any land use activities on that particular area, and it is known by each and every person. And there are those taboos and myths that are associated with that particular forest. And in that way, obviously, that has contributed towards conservation of that particular area. So in this case, you don't need rangers, you don't need police, I mean, with guns, I mean, and soldiers to guard the area by simply telling people that there are taboos. In fact, they know about the taboos. Even tourists, when they come to the area, they are told about those taboos, and obviously they research what is actually happening in the area, and in a way, you end up protecting the area. That is why these areas are now recognized by all these organizations because of the important role that they are playing in terms of
We have them in Northern Europe as well, in Norway and Sweden. Not everybody agrees to that, but
No, I know.
the problems don't disappear anyway. So and they're very similar.
I know, but I'm still looking for, did we have them in Belgium? I know.
That might be
that's
lost.
The Sami, I suppose you talk about the Sami people.
Well, in Switzerland, for example,
Sorry?
in Switzerland anyway, there's a long tradition of, how to manage water in the mountains where, some valleys have a lot of water and others don't. They have kind of ancient
Mhm.
irrigation systems. And how they manage those has quite a lot of indigenous local knowledge about, and then how they've kind of built society around the different agricultural seasons, traditionally in Switzerland. And
Maybe one last question to Christoph as we were moving at part of the discussion to this last slide. You were talking about these alternatives with respect to active mobility. So when you mentioned public transportation, are there other alternatives that you?
Yeah, I've actually been focusing on bikes, riding bikes. That's kind of a personal interest in how bike activists fared in the last 20 to 30 years in LA, thinking that they were likely to push the system, the transportation system in the right direction. So that's one. I think, as I mentioned, you have quantitative data that shows that the more bike infrastructures you have, the more people on bikes you have. So my take is that I think institutions should actually be reformed to give more leeway, more room for those people that want to move about differently. When you look at how transportation institutions in California are structured, you rapidly find out that they are at the bottom of the ladder. No money, no decision making, or hardly, and they always come after the rest. So that's, I think this is an interesting insight into transportation. Institutions should be reformed in a way that alternative mobility
so provided.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe one last question. As time is running.
Yeah, just I have a follow-up to this. How would you encourage people to bike?
I think the number one criteria is how safe is it to get out there and ride a bike. So that means we need infrastructures. If we have infrastructures, we'll have more people. The percentage of people who ride their bikes all year round with snow, super hot weather is 1 to 2%, and this will not grow unless you have the right infrastructures. There are also, I think the e-bike is interesting because it makes it easier for people to get on a bike physically wise. So security, hence infrastructure, probably and incentivize people through rebates or that will certainly help. That actually helps, not will, but it does help.
Okay, so I think the rest we need to take.
Just to, yeah, I feel that a lot of your problems are behavioral issues that are hard to change. So, is it cool to ride a bike in LA?
It's actually cooler than we think. Yeah, but again, if you live in South Los Angeles, it's not cool. It's very hot. There's no trees. If you live in the gentrified area of the LA River, now gentrified, it's much cooler because you have nice bike path, trees. They've bewildered the river. So it all depends. I think this is very interesting. The behavioral change we're looking at, trying to understand, I think is very much due to public policies. Okay, if you make it easier for people to ride their bike or catch a bus, they will do it. At least some higher percentage of people will do it.
A bike and
Yeah,
foot brakes.
San Francisco is actually has a very interesting history. It's been more active than LA. And if you look at when you look at figures, there's a lot more people riding bikes because there are a lot more infrastructures.
Good. So thank you again. Much, and I hand over to Juana.
Thank you, yeah.
Morning, it's a few minutes to with you. Yes, we have spent, I think, much time in the first session, but we try to speed up. So in the first session, we've heard of how we are running out of minerals, resources, how there are alternatives, as the research has shown. But then I think we need to rethink, how do we narrow the gap between the technical arena, as Arald was saying, and the communication? How do we get these research findings to reach the policymakers and then incorporate this into policies? Okay, without wasting much time, we will move on to the next speaker, who is Laura Terry. Laura is a senior manager at Geneva Water Hub, and she'll talk about securing municipal drinking water supply in rivalrous setting, an analysis of power resources and equity in cases of India, Spain, and the USA. Laura, time is yours, but I'll be strict with time.
Yes, be strict, be strict. I think that should be okay, but by all means, be strict. Not here, is it changing? Well, I can get started. So yes, my name is Laura Turley. I am at the University of Geneva. So the Geneva Water Hub has one branch that's here at the local university. And I just want to share some findings with you from a paper that was recently published. And it was the last paper of my PhD. So it also was like the result of a lot of churning over some difficult concepts. So in the kind of perspective today of societal relevance, even though my focus is quite narrow on water and water management as just one resource, and many of you study lots and lots of resources simultaneously, but that I definitely believe in the idea of kind of cross-fertilization, and that we can learn from management of one resource and how it can apply to others as well. So first of all, I would just take to say that my research happens very much in the context of urbanization. And so I was interested in this question, okay, of what happens when in resource scarce regions, and so my particular interest was in semi-arid river basins, when resource scarcity and urbanization kind of collide. And so we have cities that rarely can have enough water for their own demand within their jurisdiction, within their political perimeter. And so how do you kind of augment, how do you have more supply for urban areas? And so there are different ways, in the literature of how to augment supply. It comes from finding new sources of water, maybe it's groundwater, or maybe it's recycled water. It could also come from conserving water resources, so having much, more efficient appliances or policies against people excessively watering their lawns, for example. Or you can have what's called reallocation. So there's currently permits that go to certain users in society for water resources. And maybe you revisit that permitting system and say, actually, we need to reallocate this resource to other uses. So that last point is really my particular interest, on reallocation of resources. And it's a political process, right? Deciding which users get water as just like other resources. It's very embedded in political, historical, economic processes and societies. And so it's not just a technical question, it's very much a political question, and has very real impact for what is equity at the end of the day. These are 2 points I hope can apply to your research and your interests and your work. Is how do we study power, how that affects allocation, and how do we understand equity? What does equity mean? Say that these are the kind of outcomes we want. So just to say about this particular research project, I looked at 3 cities where traditionally water was used mostly in agriculture, and that over time, with the growing city center, water was reallocated to cities. And so I kind of asked, okay, well, how did they do that? How did cities secure water resources in a rivalrous setting where there are other water demands and users as well? And what I did is I did this comparative case study with 3 different regions. Again, all dry, all have quite a long experience managing water scarcity, or a long exposure to it, if not management experience. And I also did, so in addition to interviews, I also did participatory network mapping, which kind of meant that each stakeholder that I spoke to, I tried to understand in the context of reallocating water, who were they linked to, and across different criteria, and I can maybe say a quick word about that in a moment. So this is something I just hope could maybe be of interest. More broadly, it's an adaptation from what's called the Institutional Analysis and Development Framework. And this center area called the action arena, I think can be applied widely because, for example, if you're talking about, okay, how are we making a transport plan in California, or how are we integrating indigenous knowledge into policymaking? I think there are so many different social circumstances in which we can sort of call it an action arena. It's a social space where decision-making is made. So where problems are solved collectively. And so in social sciences, we look at that, critically, and we say, well, what comes into this action arena? What comes inside? Who has voice in that action arena? And what power resources do they bring into it? And so that was my big interest here, was saying, how do actors bring power resources into action arenas? And so by power resources, again, I'm obviously talking about resources in another way than we've been discussing it here at this conference, but things like having access to information, or having certainly financial resources, or having a position of authority, or having land ownership. All of these, essentially many things in society could be considered a power resource. And so to study analytically, okay, in this decision-making setting, what power resources do different actors bring? So there are authors, I use quite an old author, Jack Knight from 1992, but there are other scholars that work on the idea of power resources more recently as well. So this is what I studied analytically in this paper. I looked at 3 types of power resources: positional, which means kind of authorities and ability to kind of exert your will. I looked at financial resources, and I looked at information sharing resources. And so essentially my hypothesis was, if the cities had these power resources, this is what enabled them to secure water in a rival setting. And in terms of studying the outcomes of the research, there's a very, very dense research literature on equity, as I'm sure you can imagine, or that you're already aware of. It covers things like distributional equity, procedural equity, textual equity. And the way I looked at it was that we need a hybrid approach at the very least, where we consider on the one hand local perspectives, wherever that local might be, depending on the question. And we also have come to such a critical moment in global use of resources that we also need universal principles to help guide us with equity. And so I called it kind of the hybrid equity approach. I can talk more about it in the Q&A because I know we don't have a lot of time now. So essentially the findings of this research were that, first of all, the financing power of municipalities was high and absolutely necessary in all the cases, even though there's kind of a human right to water, and even though there's constitutional rights for water, drinking water. In practice, it's actually really the financing that always proved to be the most important in my case studies. So in India, that meant, in the city of Jaipur, that meant that they had development bank funding essentially to get new projects and secure new distribution systems. And then in Spain and in the United States, it meant more that there was, in the United States, there's actually a water market. So it quite literally means you have to buy very expensive water rights. And then in Spain, it meant as well, the financing piece was really high. And then, but it's, shockingly, positional authority is quite low, except for the case of India. And then finally, just to say equity, I did this dual analysis, right? This hybrid equity approach. So I have a lot of findings and nuance and local perspectives. And is it fair that water was reallocated to the cities? And I found lots of really surprising, unexpected perspectives. And then across more universal criteria, I used an author called, this is very good, Ingram and Wilder. They provided 5 different considerations for equity: common good, consideration of non-humans and future humans, inclusive procedures, sharing burdens, and addressing power imbalances. And so I also tried to categorize the cases along those criteria. And, I think maybe my last comment to say is just that equity is a very nuanced concept itself. We don't have there's not kind of a black and white, yes, it's equitable, yes, no, that is not. So I argue that we should be focusing more and more of our policies and our research just on equity alone. And that we need to accept that within equity, we need to be looking at it as a multifaceted concept. And so sometimes you'll be really strong in one part of equity, but you can work towards being strong in other parts too. So that's the end. And if you wanted to check out the paper, there's the, thank you. Thank you very much.
Are there any direct questions? for us?
Yes.
Very simple. How much time did you spend doing your field work?
Yes, it's, I tried to be quite fair in each of the cases. And so I spent about 15 days, just over 2 weeks doing research. And I have about 15 interviews from each location.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yes. Oh, sorry, now it's your job.
Yes, in India, you have chosen Jaipur. Do you think you will someday research Bengal? Because I heard the following anecdote. I don't know if it's absolutely accurate, that there was tension between India and Bangladesh over the sharing of the Ganges resources. So the government, central government of India in Delhi was quite willing to compromise with Bangladesh. But in between, there had been in India a law on decentralization, giving much more power to states. So the chief minister of West Bengal said that the central government was betraying the sacred interests of the West Bengal people, and she was not going to give in to Bangladesh. So I don't know if the anecdote is correct. I don't know if you have heard of that. And I don't know how this kind of conflict fits into your vision.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much. I don't maybe know the details of that case, but I can say that, yeah, we do look at, I mean, the Geneva Water Hub, we look at water conflicts at different levels. And just as an action arena can be kind of understood in a local level, we study action arenas even between countries, you know, so between India and Bangladesh, what different power resources are they bringing to that discussion, you know, because maybe it's something very concrete, again, like financing, but maybe it's something more ideational, normative, you know, development aspirations. Maybe it's return like cultural heritage or arguments. So just that might be a tool that's useful there too.
And one should never forget that the total quantity of water on Earth is a constant, more or less.
Yeah. I mean, in the interviews that you've conducted, I mean, who were your, I mean, target population? Did you perhaps, I mean, experience any challenges during the interviews?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. I didn't explain during the presentation, but for each of the cases, I had a very, very finite investigation around a reservoir. So I looked at one reservoir in each of the 3 cases, a large one, and in each of the 3 cases, one that, again, is a shared between multiple users, and over time that the city took more. So just all of my interviews were around that reservoir, in the sense that I was talking to operators of the reservoir, policymakers, user groups, not kind of individual people, individual farmers or city residents, no, but kind of like an organizational representative. So an irrigation association, a city, municipality, that sort of thing. That level, kind of like a representing.
Thank you, Laura. That was a good insight into the reallocation of resources in terms of resources and power, in terms of power and equity. So our next speaker is Sandra. She's an expert in solid waste management at SCAT Foundation, and she'll talk about Green Terrace, a learning by doing model to empower sustainable practices in communities in Bogota, Colombia.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will share with you a project, which is more on the bottom of the pyramid. We are working with the communities, trying to support the behavioral change that we need in Colombia to more sustainably manage the solid waste. The project is titled the Green Terrace, learning by doing model to empower sustainable practices in communities in Bogota, Colombia. This project is supported by COSUDE, and one of the main donators from Switzerland. I'm working with SCAD Foundation, Switzerland, but I'm originally from Colombia. So we have different organizations also locally in Colombia working on this project, including the academia. I come from the academia in Colombia, but I also was working in different stages of policy making from the university and in my PhD. So I know a bit the academic world, the policy making world, and now I have the opportunity to work more on the community. I will share with you the context of the project, the concept, and some impacts that we have achieved at this moment. Colombia is in South America, and the project is specifically in the south of Bogota. Bogota is around 9 million people, and this is the capital city of the country. And in Usme, the locality, there are around 500,000 people in the very low level of income in Bogota. This is our context. And as you know, of course, the waste management in Latin America specifically is has different issues. The per capita generation of waste is increasing also. And I think the three main problems that we have, as summarized, is the low efficiency in collection and transport services, the very, very low source separation and recycling rates, and we still use the sanitary landfill and the main technology to dispose the waste. The point in our project is the organic fraction of this waste, because as an example, in Bogota, the sanitary landfill received around 6,500 tons of waste per day, and 60% is still organic waste. So this is really an issue. If you see, this is the red point is a football field, and this is the size of our sanitary landfill. Usme, our population is near to the sanitary landfill, and of course, with this huge amount of waste, including 60% of organics, the sanitary landfill has present different landslides in different times. So now, in Bogota, we started to implement the zero waste program to separate at least recyclables, non-recyclables in 2012. And since 2 years, we started to, or the Ministry of Environment started to push the third color in our system with organics in order to prevent or start to decrease the amount of waste in our sanitary landfills. So the Green Terrace concept, the project that we are developing, try to discuss and work with the people what to separate and how to make fertilizer. We are talking about only the organic fraction of the waste, and how to use this biofertilizer, for example, in organic urban agriculture crops. So this is the idea of the concept. We are developing spaces for learning by doing in order to make the people, the residents of the neighborhoods, to verify that it can be done to decrease the amount of organics and the problems that they cause, to observe how it can be done, to motivate them to do it, and to get, of course, they involved, do it, and to teach or to motivate them to teach, for example, in their family and their own context. This is the idea of the green terrace. We started in 2021 with the initial in a pilot phase, centralized or focused only in organic waste treatment and demonstration. So we have a physical space with a composting technology, small composting technology, and also with seedbed and a community garden in order to show the people how to close this cycle with organic waste. This includes, of course, teach how to correctly separate the waste to be composted and so on. And then we started to facilitate the multiplication of the learning and to create more alliances and to promote also not only the community garden, but also family garden in order to they reply these actions in their own homes. This year we are focused. We are continuing with this initial strategies. We have now 3 main points of the green terrace in these neighborhoods, and we are identified also with people, for example, the opportunity to create small companies, small businesses, for example, selling the products of the garden or selling the compost, for example. But this is not the main goal, but is collateral result. And we are doing a training of a Green Terrace Academy. This is a train of trainers in order to increase our impact. So in the pilot phase, 3 years of the project, we have around 350 families regularly involved, but around 2,500 people involved in the green terrace. Around 60% are planting in their house plants, vegetables or herbs. Around 15% separate organic waste in a good way, and demonstrated way, and around 10% have improved their income in some way. So we have identified as the main challenge for the next years. The project is supposed to go until 2028, so we have time to tackle these challenges. We want to increase the local technical capacity through this type of train of trainers. We have to promote the product exchange networks also and enhance the local economic opportunities from the products and involve the territorial entities because the territorial entities have the responsibility for the solid waste management system, and we are supporting them to create the basis for the cultural change that they need to implement these regulations in the city as pilot project. Thank you. You can find more information and documents of the project.
Request that we hold on to our questions until the last speaker is done. Then we just move on to the next speaker, and then we ask all the questions at the end. How is that? Is that okay? Yes. Yes. So the next speaker is Shamira Ahmed. She's an executive director of the Data Economy Policy Hub, and she is also working as a policy entrepreneur and contributive economist. So Shamira will talk about gender equity for a just green digital twin transition, a multi-level mapping of South Africa's value chains and sectors.
Continue. Wait, just a second.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe let's just go back to Sandra with the questions while we are setting up the presentation. Any questions for? Yes.
I've got both a question for Laura and Sandra. Sandra, I don't know what's the Spanish name for waste pickers. Do they play a role also in this? Are you considering incorporating them also in your project?
Yeah, of course, yes, because the context in which they actually live is these communities. We have involved some recyclers, but not in this organic waste topic. With the university, we have another action line with non-organic materials, and they are more involved in this part with plastics and another materials. But yes, they are part of the community.
To Laura, to connect with the Ganges in India and Pakistan, what about the Nile in Africa? Would you consider studying that? Because this is becoming a geopolitical issue. And equity, I don't even know how to start it.
So again, the Geneva Water does take interest in that case as well. We actually did a controversy mapping. I wasn't part of it, so that's why I'm not quite sure. But so where they kind of mapped out the different discourses that come from the different river-based states, and how there are these really strong, political messages that come through, obviously as threats, and so. I mean, the short answer is, in an ideal scenario, is that you would see the Nile River as a shared resource in the basin, and see that some of the riparian countries have different strengths, or how should I say this? For example, in Egypt, cotton has been grown for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it's maybe not the best place in the basin to grow cotton from a water resource perspective. So are there not other ways where we can think in a whole basin perspective, say, well, here the real strength could be hydroelectricity production. Here the real strength is agricultural production. It's a little utopian, but it might need to be the way we think on a river basin scale in terms of water management.
Any other questions?
I have also a question to you. What about the conflict with industrial applications? Is this relevant for the regions that you looked at? And do you think what would be then the major change in the picture when you consider that?
I think I could have looked at it a bit more explicitly. I kind of grouped it into in some ways, municipal demand because of the industries that are located around cities. In both the United States and Spain case studies, what really struck me was how historical water access matters so much. It's the traditional, it's the earlier users who have permits who manage to hang on to them in spite of very real changes in society. You still have certain users, maybe they're industrial as well, or agricultural, that hang on to the water rights. So that strikes me as something important, is to look from a historical perspective.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I have a question for Sandra. I think your last slide, you showed the outcomes, and so 60% of people grow their own vegetables, but only, I think, 8% makes organic waste into compost. I was wondering, do they then use other fertilizers, artificial? Is it a question of trust or of other reasons, cultural, well, there are quite some people growing the vegetables, but they don't see the value of.
Thank you very much for your question. Yeah, this is very important because this is actually one of the permanent issues with for example, the indicators that we should show with the project in 3 years. But this is not only the cultural change that requires just to separate the waste, but also we are promoting to make in the houses composting and vermiculture, and this is not easy to do because you can attract mosquitoes and different vectors, and if you try to treat the organic waste with worms, it is also not easy. But they are doing the separation and giving the waste in the centralized green terrace. But the issue is to achieve more families doing the treatment in situ, because we have like the legislation for 3 years ago to make this separation, but the city doesn't have the system yet. So we are working in advance to trying to change the cultural habits, and so that we thought we can try to promote an in situ treatment while the city treatments are going. So in the train of trainers that we are piloting this year, the idea is to make or to support from the next year these people that is taking this technical training in composting, that are inhabitants also in the neighborhoods, to promote within the neighborhoods with the families this implementation of in situ, but it's not easy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll give the chance to Shamira. She'll go through a presentation without the PowerPoint, unfortunately, because time is going, only 2 minutes, in fact, 1 minute to pass us. We would like to request you to give us just a few minutes of your break so that you can do.
Yes, please.
Yes.
So thank you again for the opportunity to be here. My name is Shamira Ahmed. I'm the Executive Director of the Data Economy Policy Hub, the DEP Hub, and we are the first independent think tank founded by Indigenous African women in South Africa. So our research is based on gender equity for a just green digital twin transition, a multi-level mapping of South Africa's value chains and sectors. The research is part of the DEP Hub's ongoing flagship project on responsible AI for Africa's just transition to the circular economy. It's part of a bigger multi-country study that's part of the Gender Responsible AI Network. And this particular study or presentation is based on the South Africa findings. It's part of a 5-phase process. And in South Africa, we're still in the first phase, just mapping the literature, the academic and grey literature on the subject before we move on to the second phase, which would be data collection. So the background for our project is that it's based on the fact that the idea of a green digital twin transition, which aims to integrate sustainability principles into our digital technologies and infrastructure across various industries, has gained quite a lot of traction, but most of the traction or the advocacy about the green digital twin transition is from predominantly global North ecosystems. There is very limited attention paid to the unique challenges of the global majority and what a green digital twin transition would mean for the global majority. Do we have the endowments, the capabilities, from the digital divide to the actual issues with a green transition? And is it a just transition that reflects all the nuances of the global South or the global majority? And in the South African context, there is a significant knowledge gap regarding the conditions necessary for advancing the use of data-driven digital technologies to support a just green digital twin transition. There's also a lack of understanding of the barriers hindering industry-wide implementation across various value chains and sectors. And even though we have a just transition framework that's being championed by the presidency in our country, the framework does mention gender sensitive interventions and the digital economy very lightly, but it doesn't have a coherent view or a coherent strategy in joining those two seemingly opposite or seemingly opposite kind of frameworks or the issues in the digital economy and the just transition issues. There's also limited consideration of the intersection between data governance, digital development, gender equity, and climate and environmental justice. So our research is driven by the need to develop a proactive, gender responsive, and policy interventions that supports a just green digital twin transition. And we do this by examining the complex web of interactions within South Africa's value chains and sectors. And we aim to provide evidence-based policy-oriented recommendations and identify future areas for research. And like I mentioned, this research is still ongoing. We're only in the first phase. We have other phases, but the idea behind the study is based on two objectives. The first objective is to gain a comprehensive understanding of the gender dynamics within the sub-Saharan African value chains, because it is part of a bigger project. So we'll start transnational research from South Africa and broaden it to regional perspective, and then look at other countries across the continent and have some kind of comparative analysis. So on the methodology, the three tentative sectors identified were industry. The tentative three sectors identified for South Africa because the South African ecosystem from the digital divide and the structural ICT infrastructure, for instance, South Africa is different from other countries that we're going to study across the continent. So for South Africa, and from our initial scoping, we thought that these would be the most common ones and the most interesting ones, also for anticipatory governance. Infrastructure development within the green digital transition. The second one was gender dimensions within data governance for environmental data and sustainable agri-tech and agriculture, to focus on the food insecurity issues in sub-Saharan Africa. So the second objective of the study is to define the scope of research, including the specific industries and regions within South Africa that will be the focus of investigation. And we found that this is crucial for ensuring that the research is targeted and can provide actionable insights for policy development related to a just green digital transition. So as I mentioned, our methodology is a 5-phase process. We are still in the first process. And it's based on using a transdisciplinary lens on socio-technical theory, policy coherence and systems thinking, intersectional, eco-feminist, and industrial economics. So it is, like someone mentioned, a smorgasbord of lens that we're looking at, because there are a lot of nuances that come about into the research based on the different countries we're focusing on. Then the second phase is primary data collection, where we intend to capture the gender dimensions in the workforce, wage disparities, access to leadership positions, and other issues in the broader ecosystem and with the stakeholders. And then because it is a policy-oriented study, we will engage with stakeholders by collecting qualitative data through interviews. And then in the fourth phase, based on the information we have, we're going to map the information we have based on a country level, sector level, depending on what arises in the data that we have. And then lastly, develop gender sensitive policy recommendations. And we will also have an intersectional inequalities approach, where we're not just focusing on gender in isolation. We want to see if young women of particular race or ethnicity experience more vulnerability based on the three areas that we decided to focus on. And our guiding question is, how can we, it's a very broad question, how can we foster gender sensitive governance and policy interventions within the South African context to ensure a just towards a green digital future? Our considerations are like the complex interplay of digitalization, sustainability, and gender equity in various value chains and sectors. So our preliminary findings, because this is still ongoing and it's only on one country so far, our preliminary findings are that there is limited literature and strategies on how to create an enabling policy and regulatory environment for a just green digital twin transition in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Africa, where this study was focused on. We need systematic integration of diversity, equity, and inclusion in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics field. Because most of the innovation or entrepreneurship that we're focusing on in the digital economy requires those strong skills where there's a leaky pipeline from women, the culture in those ecosystems are not accommodating, and there's generally well-known other published issues in those areas that discriminate against women and other groups. And we also want to support gender responsive data collection for the just green digital twin transition. We don't have a lot of sex disaggregated data on the digital economy, on the impacts of climate change, for food insecurity, and for infrastructure, and how policies impact policies on the digital economy. For example, conducting a longitudinal study, we don't have any of that information to do that research because there's data scarcity in Africa, especially in the areas of digital transformation and in climate gender nexus with the climate gender nexus and digitalization. And then we found out that we need to enhance meaningful participation of women in leadership roles in various ecosystems across value chains. And it's not only as developers of innovations, not only as data analysts, it's also women in policy making, women in leadership roles, other than the policy side, in developing solutions as entrepreneurs, and so on and so forth. And we also need a policy coherence and systems thinking approach, because at the moment, everything is approached in silos and there's no coherence. The digital economy is seen as separate to the rest of the economy for the just transition, but it should be integrated more. And that's very
Okay. No questions for Shami.
Is this a national project? How deep down are you going in these communities to find out about the gender issues, the roles of women? Because when you mention the system, it's those women at the bottom level who really make the difference. So
yeah, so we in our data collection phase, this is based on findings for phase 1. Our data collection phase, we do want to find out those like wage disparities, positions, work conditions, and we will have focus groups and other data collection, interactive data collection mechanism with people in the different ecosystems. So we will have different countries. It might not be national, it might be based on a small sample in South Africa and other countries, but because of resource and time constraints, we will try and make this indicative as possible to realities, because it's policy oriented.
Maybe the last question.
What is the legacy of Winnie Mandela on gender issues in South Africa?
I don't know, honestly.
You know who she is?
Yes, no, I know Winnie
Okay,
Mandela.
that's already a one
I think
point.
there's been a lot of South Africans advocated for gender rights. It wasn't only Winnie Mandela, so that's what I know for sure. So I don't know her specific legacy, but I know there's been plenty South African women advocating for gender rights actively and still doing it.
So in any case, she didn't fund your research.
Our research was funded by the IDRC. Part of the GRF responsible.
She's alright, said he was considered to be a criminal.
She may have committed the foundation.
Only thank all the speakers, all the these for the interesting discussions and
Can we have
sorry for the
voting?
technical issues.
You go one slide on this, voting QR.